Thank you all for being here, and thank you to everyone online for being part of this 2023 Science, Technology, and Human Rights Conference. About 15 years ago, a group of scientists, engineers, association leaders, and human rights practitioners gathered around an idea: a coalition of scientific societies that could together be an international voice for the human right to scientific progress and its applications. This coalition could be a place where the scientific community would share methods and technologies with human rights practitioners and could coordinate their expertise in advocacy for scientific freedom and responsibility. In 2009, the Science and Human Rights Coalition launched, with AAAS as the secretariat. The coalition has worked long and hard to support students who want to combine science, technology, and human rights in their education and careers, which is why we're so proud of the SciTech Human Rights Scholars Initiative. These students receive a stipend to apply the principles of the right to science to a project where they're working alongside community members. Last year, Amber Mundy's research at Virginia Commonwealth University on the East Marshall Street Well project, Amber was recognized as a Future Gen Scholar, and we're delighted that the coalition is now supporting Sierra Lavaroni and her work, which is connected also with the East Marshall Street Well project, but addresses a different research question. Through our support for these two students and their mentor, Tal Simmons, who is also a member of the Coalition Steering Committee, many coalition members have learned from this exemplary project about research ethics, community participation, and how scientific knowledge can be and needs to be shared. We've learned about how medical researchers treated human remains, primarily of African Americans, in an unethical, egregious, and disrespectful fashion, denying these individuals the dignity everyone deserves after death. With the active engagement of descendants and community members, the ongoing research aims to address those past harms by responsibly identifying and returning the individual's remains. No pictures of identifiable individual remains will be shown during this session, but some attendees and viewers may find the content disturbing. Thank you to everyone involved with the East Marshall Street project and East Marshall Street Well project for joining us today, for your work on the project, and for sharing your experience with us this morning. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Stephanie Smith, a member of the Family Representative Council for the East Marshall Street Well project. It's a special privilege to participate in this Science, Technology, and Human Rights Conference today with colleagues from VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, in Richmond, Virginia. There are two other members of the Family Representative Council here with me today, Dr. Joe Jones and Dr. Carmen Foster. In addition, we have staff members from VCU, Dr. Kevin Allison and Dr. Stephen Davenport. I'm speaking it into fruition. And we have researchers who have worked on this project with us. Dr. Tal Simmons is not able to be with us in person today. She is currently in Israel doing forensic work there because of the war there. And we pray for her safe return to us. We have with us today Philippa Simmons, Barashar Singh, and Sierra Lavaroni. They will introduce themselves further later and will talk to you about what they are working on. Today, I will introduce the history of the East Marshall Street Well project. As I said, it'll be followed by the researchers and scientists who've been working on this project with us. We each have a name. The ancestral remains, however, have no name. They have no family to speak for them either. I am one of 7 people in the Richmond community who volunteered to represent these remains and stand in as family for them. To acknowledge these remains, please join me in a moment of reflection and reverence. We acknowledge the lives, history, and unrecognized legacy of those individuals whose remains were discovered in the East Marshall Street well, and pay our respect to elders, both past and present. Today, we will travel through time. So hang on, I'm gonna zip you back to 1838 and bring you back up to 2020. This is the story about human remains, ancestral remains that were discarded by the Medical College of Virginia over a century ago behind the Egyptian building, which is a medical school and anatomy building in Richmond on the VCU medical campus. These remains were used for medical students to learn anatomy. The bodies of African descent were first sold as a commodity in Richmond's Shockoe Bottom, where human beings were traded, purchased, sold, and enslaved. They were stripped of their human dignity and their freedom. They were considered a mere human commodity to enrich the pockets of their enslavers. Then they were stolen in death as another commodity to be sold again for the medical dissection and anatomy. After being used during their lifetimes and after their deaths, their bodies were dumped and discarded in the deep well pits behind the medical school. These remains were human beings, not commodities. They were human beings with families, with hopes, with aspirations, with dreams of freedom. They never had a memorial service or dignity or respect. Now, our first stop on this time travel is Richmond, 1838. This is the old Union Hotel located in Shockoe Bottom at the bottom of the hill of 19th Street and Main Street. It was the original medical department of Hampton-Sydney College. Hampton-Sydney College predated the Medical College of Virginia. The first class contained 46 students. They took 6 courses and paid $20 for each course. But why Richmond? During this time, Richmond's population total was 20,000 people. There were 7,500 Black enslaved people and 1,900 Black non-enslaved people. The Richmond slave trade industry was second only in importance to New Orleans between 1830 and 1865. In slave trade auction houses, offices, slave jails, and residences of the most prominent slave traders that were scattered throughout the Shockoe Bottom area, it was a primary market for the domestic slave trade. Up to 50 enslaved people every day were auctioned into the Deep South by enslavers. This profitable trade did much breaking up of families, purchasing enslaved women, interrogating them about their reproductive history, and bred them for profit, trafficking enslaved children who were too young to work, and separating infant children wailing from their parents. In 1830s, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Richmond was booming. Enslaved labor was used in all kinds of manufacturing, commerce, and production. Tobacco, flour mills for sure, and the Tredegar Iron Works along the James River, which supplied cannon and ordnance for the federal government, as well as railroad spikes, rails, and axles, was a booming industry. In 1844, this building here, the Egyptian building, was constructed and began the first permanent home for the medical department, which is a space used and created specifically for medical education. This new home on Academy Square, called the Egyptian Building, was where medical students dissected and practiced surgical procedures on unlawfully obtained cadavers. Next, we have a picture of Dr. Augustus Warner, who was the first dean of the medical facility. He was the first professor of surgical anatomy. And here's an advertisement he used to recruit students. Note, he said, there's an abundance of materials for anatomical purposes, and the reduced price at which they are furnished will enable the student to acquire an intimate knowledge of the anatomy of the human body and the use of surgical instruments. The abundance of anatomical materials represented the large population of enslaved people as a commodity who were engaged in grueling, difficult, and often dangerous labor. The rules for the dissecting room noted that the value of a body of a subject for dissection was $5. Dr. Levin Jones, the dean of faculty, responded to an insinuation that appeared in a local newspaper denying the accusation that anyone who goes to the college infirmary and dies there will be used in the dissecting room after death. He responded that no patient dying in the infirmary, whether white or black, is ever sent to the dissecting room, but the body is in every case decently interred in the public burial grounds. I wonder how those bodies got in the well. These are the medical students, the next pictures, these are the medical students in the dissecting room. Look at the expressions on their faces as they pose with the remains. Consider that they're wearing or what they're not wearing and where they place their hands. I wonder what that room smelled like then. And to the left, notice this man here. His name is Christopher Baker. He's the anatomical man. He lived and worked in the school in the late 1800s. He looked after cadavers that were used in dissections. The medical community valued him, yet he was despised and feared by his own community. People who stole dead bodies from public burial grounds were known as resurrectionists, which I find ironic. They not only sold those corpses to the Medical College of Virginia, corpses were also shipped in barrels of salt to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville to provide medical specimens for their anatomy students as well. In 2011, VCU professor Sean Utsi produced a documentary, Until the Well Runs Dry. That documentary caused quite a stir across the university and the city. His documentary highlights the story of medicine at MCV and the exploitation of Black bodies. We will preview this film in the afternoon session. This documentary was produced 15 years after human remains were found in 1994 during the excavation for the construction of the new Medical Science Building at VCU, now known as the Contos Building. This is located down on their medical campus. The site for this new Medical Sciences Building had been the former location of St. Philip's Hospital, a segregated medical facility for African Americans with a school to train African American nurses. While the VCU Archaeological Research Center prepared for a professional excavation of the site, university administrators only gave the center a few days to exhume the study of the human remains. On that final day of work, the archaeologists watched in horror as backhoe operators pulled buckets full of human remains before the construction crews covered the well and continued the construction process. The university failed to file a report on the discovery and removal of the remains, and no mention was ever made of the well. While archaeologists salvaged what they could, remains of 53 individuals, including 9 children from the mid-19th century, they sent the collection to the Smithsonian for analysis and storage. President Michael Rao became VCU's president in 2009. In 2011 through 2013, he gathered community and university representatives together to begin the path to reconciliation. The planning committee that you see there held a series of thoughtful community meetings and discussions and computer displays to educate the community on what had happened and to seek input from them. VCU acknowledged its insensitivity during the 1994 excavation and shared what had been done to safeguard the remains and what had been learned through the forensic study. And I will turn it over to Joe Jones. Thank you.
All right, good morning. My name is Joe Jones. I'm a biological anthropologist at the College of William & Mary and a former chair and a current member of the Family Representative Council. My role here today is a bit transitional. I'm going to walk you through the process by which through which the Family Representative Council came up with its recommendations, and then turn you over to the scientists who will explain to you where we are with respect to the implementation of those, particularly around the question of DNA ancestry. And so you see here the members of the Family Representative Council. I will not read the names, as you can do so for yourself. But as Stephanie mentioned, the formation of the FRC, the Family Representative Council, was the culmination of a process that began in 2011 following the production of the film by Dr. Sean Utsi. It was a process that built on a model that comes out of the work of the New York African Burial Ground in the earlier, probably about 20 to 25 or so years ago, when an early African-American cemetery was found in Lower Manhattan. And out of that project, which was the first systematically community engaged what we call bioarchaeological research, right? The study of skeletal remains in archaeological context, similar to that of the East Marshall Street well, different only in location and scale. But that model was one that sometimes referred to as the ethical clientage model, was one that was designed so that research could be conducted in a way that is ethical and sensitive to community needs, and really in such a way that the community drives the process. And so it was a model that was developed so that researchers could be accountable to their funding sources, but at the same time, and most importantly, perhaps, and more importantly, to the ethical clients, that is the community members, who again help to define the research process, determine when research is appropriate, what type or what level of research is done, and then ultimately also there is accountability to the professional standards. And so we talk to community members, explain to them, what the scientific rigor is that is required to find the answers that they may want, and then also to walk them through all of the steps that would be required to acquire, those answers. And so would this require invasive analysis, as is conducted for DNA or chemical research, or is it a process by which we simply memorialize and reinter the remains respectfully? And so this model was applied to the East Marshall Street well process. It began in 2015 through a series of community consultations during which the broader public was invited to hear about the well, to learn about the well, and also to learn about its broader context. And so this is, I think, a really good example of what we might If we think about engagement, the various forms of engagement that can take place, public education and outreach, advocacy, even activism. This is a really an excellent example of public education and outreach on the part of Virginia Commonwealth University, again, under President Rao's leadership, and that of Dr. Kevin Allison, who is with us today. And so through that process of community consultations, the community was informed about the site, and they were asked during the last of those consultation meetings, what the criteria might be for folks who would then go on to serve further as members of the Family Representative Council. And so we moved from a model of public or community engagement to one of descendant community engagement. And in this case, as Stephanie has mentioned, these individuals are not known, certainly not known by name. And so the Family Representative Council came to serve as a symbolic or surrogate family, using a model that we call social ancestry or social descent in this case, when biological affinity could not be established. And so through that process, the 10 of us came to serve on the FRC and went through again, further education, hearing from geneticists, folks who were there at the time of the actual excavation, of the well, visiting different sites where memorialization and reinterment activities had taken place, all so that we could come to informed decisions and to establish recommendations for research, memorialization, and ultimately the interment of these remains. We initially said the reinterment, but given the possible history of grave robbing, some of these people may have been reinterred. Others, knowing also the broader history of the the way that bodies were procured for medical study, some of them may be interred for the very first time, and so research, memorialization, and interment recommendations were developed over the course of this several-year process of our learning, as the FRC, and debating and giving serious, deep consideration to a range of questions. Again, the question of whether or not research should be done at all was one that, early on preoccupied us. And once we kind of cleared that hurdle and decided that, we really were there to represent the broader wishes of the community, and that they were very clear during those community consultation meetings in 2015 that they did want to see research done to include genetic analysis, then we took steps to figure out then what would that look like respectfully. How do we go about respectfully carrying out analysis that is invasive, that does require the sampling is a nice way of saying, or the cutting or removal of, parts of bones or teeth or what have you. And so we work through, these questions, should research be done? What type or what level of research? How intensive or invasive should the analysis be? Where should the remains be reburied? And so this became very important for us. You'll see in a moment, one of our initial recommendations, in fact, we can go ahead here. Our initial recommendation was the return of the ancestral remains from the Smithsonian, where they had been held for some time, back to VCU, back to Richmond. And so that took place in 2019. There was a process of the ancestral return, in which we treated them. One of our current chair, Rhonda Keys-Pleasants, actually manages and as an expert in funeral services, and she helped us to design a process by which we would respectfully return the remains using hearses and not simply boxing them up and shipping them down as is common, practice. And so you could see that there were a range of different types of views, things that, although I'd worked on the African Burial Ground project as an undergraduate and had long been involved with this type of research, there were views that, community views that really helped to broaden, my own understanding of what, real true community engagement means, and what bringing in the value of bringing in these outside perspectives, what that can entail for us as researchers, as scientists. And so you see here the other recommendations with respect to research. The remains were returned, as I mentioned, in 2019. Currently, there's feasibility study to determine whether or not additional remains are still found under the site, under the building. There's very good likelihood that there are, and so that has implications for how we memorialize the site. We are interested in returning this, making this a sacred site, and yet it's a site of daily activity, right, scholarly activity. And so how do we merge those those interests and those goals? We developed a research agenda for the study of the remains. Again, you'll hear more about that momentarily from the scientists who are here with us. But that also was a process. You know, this establishing a single research agenda proved challenging, and in practice, what happens is that we developed a vetting process by which the FRC remains involved with the project and still has oversight over the types of research that are done. And I'm glossing over a few things that we will be able to talk about in a little more detail this afternoon with respect to establishing what we call our biocultural research, agenda. So we mentioned future analysis going forward, aside from the DNA and chemical analysis that is currently underway. Future analysis will be non-destructive and non-invasive. And then also, it's very important for us that this be a project that not only looks backwards historically, but that also connects in very real and tangible ways to the present. And so the most obvious area of kind of personal and community connection would be that since these remains were found, the ancestral remains were found on the site of a medical campus, that there's a direct tie, and given how they were used, the purpose for which these remains were taken and used, we connect and there's been co-programming developed along with the Virginia VCU Health, its medical school campus as well. Okay, so this is this image of the return. There we see two other members of the FRC, Christopher Rashad, who is placing the ancestral remains into the back of the hearse, and that is our current chair, Rhonda Keys Pleasance, who is assisting him there. All right. So I mentioned that my role is kind of transitional here. I'm going to turn you over to the scientists, but you can see here the specific recommendations as it relates to the DNA analysis, which they will be able to walk you through in more detail. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and good morning, everyone. My name is Baneshwar Singh. I am an associate professor in the Department of Forensic Science at VCU. And I will just go over the science part of the project and what we have done so far and what we are still working on. So as you can see, these are some of the purpose for the analysis. First reassociate all the skeletal remains. So we have several parts of the bones. We are trying to use DNA tapping so that we know that how many individuals were there. And then the second was to see if we can find out the genetic ancestry of those individuals. And the third goal was to determine sex of those individuals, especially for the children. And then the fourth was to see if we can find out how those people might have died. Is there any health conditions? So use the microbiome approach to see if we can find out the health condition of those individuals. And the last part is to try to connect the ancestor with the descendant, how we can connect these two, from the current population, can we connect those individuals? Can we find out some descendant from those skeletal remains? So these were the goals of the project. Do we have? Okay. So this is just an example. These are not the bones from the East Marshall Street Well project, but it just show you what are the different approach we have followed. So first thing, we already had some information about the pair matching between the long bones. So we had the pair matched bone from Smithsonian, and we wanted to see with DNA whether those pair matched bones, like limb, like a hand and leg bones, whether those bones are matched properly using anthropological information or not. So that you can see in this area, we had like all these pair, the black line indicate what are the pairs that we are trying to match. Can you go next? Yeah. So this is overall approach that we have followed. As you can see, we have total 516 bones. On the left side is on the sequencing part, the right side is on the genotyping part. So as you can see, we had like 26 cranial bone and 9 mandibles. So those were the individuals. So we knew that these are from one individual. So we did high throughput sequencing on these bones to find out their biogeographical ancestry, their sex, eye color, hair color, as well as their identity. So this was done using high throughput sequencing, and we have already done this part. So we know how many individuals were here, what their ancestry is, and what hair color and eye color and sex those individuals had. But then the right side, we have the 481 bones. Those bones were like, the leg bones, hand bones, ribs, scapula, and all those bones. So we did, as you can see, we did sampling, identification, and then we did DNA typing using enotyper kit. So it is slightly different than the STR kit we use normally, because these enotyper kits use like a insertion deletion kind of a process where we can identify individuals using this insertion and null alleles. So this approach is better in the case when we have too much degraded samples. Like these bones, we did not expect it to work very well with a normal traditional STR typing method. So we use, similarly for the extraction, we use a kit that were more appropriate for these bones. Once we had allelic information or identification, we tried to match it with the profile that we already had for the individuals, like from the cranial and mandible. If it matched, then we don't have to go further because we already have the cranial, mandible, and the bones matching. If it did not match, then we go to see, maybe they are the new individuals or unique individuals for which we don't have crania or we don't have mandible. So then we went for the right side, you can see there. We tried to establish unique identity of new individuals which may not have all bones recovered. And then we again did same process. We did the forensic sequencing kit, high throughput sequencing for biogeographical ancestry of those individuals. So first, we tried to find more phenotypic characters, biogeographical ancestry, and identification of discrete individuals. Then we tried to find if we can make another discrete individual based on the enotyper. And if we find that, okay, we have the another individuals for which we don't have crania or mandible, then we try to find, can we find the biogeographical information about those individuals? So that's the approach. So here, I think in the first approach, we tried to match, as you can see, all the anthropological paired long bones. And this is approximate number. So we had around 250, paired bones. That means the limb bones and hand bones were paired anthropologically. And then we had around 300 bones which were not paired, long bones. So they were bones but not paired with second part. Next, yeah. So here, this is just something about the the process that we followed. As you can see on the right side, the picture suggests why we use a enotyper kit. As you can see, the size range for the enotyper kit is only 63 to 123 base pair. That means even if we have degraded sample, there is a better chance that this will work compared to like a normal traditional kit, which range from anywhere from 70, 60 to 450 to 500 base pair. So longer DNA, the alleles for that, it may be hard to recover when you have a degraded bones. So in the sampling, we use the Dremel tool to get 40 milligram of the bone powder. For each time we got the sample, we got approval from Family Representative Council. So we did not, and then we had a photograph done before the sampling, photograph done after the sampling. And then we tried to use the area like in the cranium, we use the petrous portion of the bone, or where we feel like we have better chance of getting the DNA. Like we also use some endosternum area where it's more dense area of bone where we thought that we'll get more DNA. That DNA extraction was done using extract kit, which is kind of, specifically designed, or, they have been successful on the challenging and low DNA samples, like hair samples and degraded bone samples. We quantified those DNA using the Quant qPCR kit, and then typed those with insertion and null alleles using the typer kits. Next slide, please. So what we found that almost 87% of the pairing done by anthropologically was matching with DNA analysis. So we had almost 87% concordance between anthropology and the DNA result. Then we had almost 30% data where it did not match. So can you go next slide, please? So far we tried to get profile from 121 bones, but 52 samples gave really nice profile that can be used for the analysis. And then some individuals we were able to, match the leg bones with the hand bones, even the pair matching and then making the individuals. So we had at least 8 individuals where we were able to match both leg and hand bones together. Then we had almost 13 individuals where we were able to match arm to arm and leg to leg bones. So, and then currently we are working on many unpaired bones so that we can put those unpaired bones along with the paired bone to make individuals that can become individuals. Next slide, please. This is just showing one example of the profile of how we matched it. On the top, you can see this is like a same, different bones, sample 1 and sample 2, but it's like on all the alleles, as you can see, all the alleles are perfectly matched between these, paired matched bone samples, the leg bone samples. And once we had the profile that was completely matching and good, and then we considered them as same individuals. And then we also did the likelihood ratio test to see what ancestry these persons may have. Next slide, please. So this is just showing, how many bones were individuals. So these are the 13 individuals, and it shows, all the bones that we have matched and put them together. So the green, you can see that we have almost 7 or 8 bones that were matched together for individual 1, same for individual 5, and then for individual 11. For some individual, we had only 3 or 4 bones, the long bones that were matched. So we are still working on unpaired bones and some other bones that we can put them together on these individuals. The next part, my colleague, Dr. Philippa Simon, will talk on how we determine ancestry of these bones, and then I will come back again.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Philippa Simão. I'm a postdoc researcher at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I'm working on this part of the DNA information for these human remains. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how are we addressing one of the recommendations of the FRC in terms of finding out the ancestry and the physical traits of these individuals. How we do this is basically we compare the genetic profiles that we have of our unknown individuals with genetic information that we already have with known individuals. So we compare the profiles. We know that we have genetic patterns that are representing different hair colors or different eye colors, and we also have different genetic patterns that represent different continental ancestries. So basically that's what we have been doing, comparing our unknown genetic profile from an unknown person to those that we already are known. So this is just an example of the results that we are having. We have two different examples. On your left, you can see an example of an African individual. So basically what we have in the graphic is a principal component analysis, which is the representation of this genetic information, and now they are similar or different. So we have each dot represents a known individual, and we have different colors for different genetic ancestries. So we can see, for instance, we have different dots, blue dots for African ancestry, we have different pink dots for European ancestry, and we can see that our unknown sample, which is the red dot, clusters together with the African one. So we know that this individual has African ancestry. So we also have information in this case for the hair and eye color, and this is based on probabilistically. So we know that most probably this individual that you find on your left has most probably brown or black hair color and also has brown eyes. On the other side, we have an example on your right side, we have an example of a completely different individual. In this case, we see that our red dot, which is our unknown sample or unidentified human remain, clusters together with the pink dots, which is of European ancestry. And also this individual seems to have most probably a blonde hair color and blue eyes. So these are two examples of individuals that we found on the well. So here we have a broad information of what we found until now. So this is the ancestry analysis of 18 skulls. So we have 18 individuals represented here. And we can see that there was, in fact, a targeting of African Americans. As you can see that most of these individuals have major African ancestry, but we also found two individuals with major European ancestry and two others with a mix, one of those with mix of European and African ancestry, and another one with European and Native American ancestry. So another approach that we are doing in terms of finding the ancestry of these individuals is using what we call parental markers or uniparental markers. So we have the mitochondrial DNA. The mitochondrial DNA is this small molecule that we all have, however, is inherited only by the mothers. So it means that my mitochondrial DNA is the same as my mother's and is the same as my grandmother. So with this information, we can trace the history of a maternal line. So we are complementing this information on general ancestry with this maternal line. So here we have three examples of that information. So again, it's a process of comparing what we have from our unknown individuals to what is already described out there. And we can see here the prevalence of this maternal genetic line of these three different samples. One of them has a prevalence more in the west region of Africa. We have another one more northeastern Africa, and we have another one which is kind of unclear, but is distributed all over Africa. Using the same thinking, we also are predicting this ancestry on the paternal line, so using the Y chromosome. So the Y chromosome only the biological males have is passed from one father to their son. So this means that we can trace, in this case, not the maternal line, but the paternal history of the individuals. Of course, this can only be performed on those human remains which are males. So in this case, it's kind of the same representation that I showed you before for the ancestry predictions. We have different individuals with different ancestries in red, in green and blue dots. And with a black cross, you have our unknown samples. And so we also can trace these three samples to a west central origin within Africa. So of course, if we match this information that we have on the genetic part, on the history part of the transatlantic slave trade, knowing the origin and the destination of the routes, we can get a deeper information on these individuals, on their story, where they came from, and also maybe having some information on their ethno-linguistic affiliation. And of course, it's the goal afterwards is put together all of this genetic information, the historic information, both the autosomal ancestry and the lineage information, genetic information, so we can get deeper understanding. So in this case, we have here an example of an individual. We call it here sample 1, which is an African individual. And when we go back to the lineage markers, we see that probably this individual came from West Central origin in Africa, in the region of Cameroon, Nigeria, around that area. So another goal that was proposed for, from the FRC was try to identify living relatives with these individuals. As Stephanie was saying, these are people without names, and maybe we can try to find a name for them. So we are planning to do this using, as I said before, talk to you about the mitochondrial DNA and tracing the maternal origin of these individuals. So this is something that we are probably going to start soon. And the idea, of course, it has to have a genealogical and historical research prior. So we need to find people who can trace their family history to the Richmond area, to the time where the bodies were placed on the well. And for the last part, I'll ask Dr. Singh again.
Thank you, Dr. Simao. So we also did the microbiome, as I said, so we had many remains had dental calculus, and we got around 20 dental calculus, and we wanted to see what are the microbiome of those dental calculus. And out of those, we are still working, but we were able to sequence 4 individuals. Out of that, 3 gave the microbiome. And the next slide. And then we found that, at least one individual had high abundance of Mycobacterium genus, and most probably it was Mycobacterium tuberculosis. So it's most probably, I think, at least one person had tuberculosis when they were in the well. We don't know much detail because with the sequencing, we did not go to the species level. We know the genus was Mycobacterium, but we are suspecting that it may be the tuberculosis, that case. So we are still working on the remaining dental calculus, and we have collected many, one of the graduate students is working on connecting how the microbiome of dental calculus was there at that time compared to the modern day dental calculus and the recently died people. So that's also one project going on. And then in the end, with the science part and DNA part, I just want to acknowledge all the people who work for this project. Dr. Simmons is not here today, but she is the PI. I am the co-PI, and Dr. Simao is a postdoctoral associate with this project. And then there are many students. One of them is Sierra Lebrani, she is here. And many of them graduated. The one you see in the red, they have done their master project. One you see in the blue, those students are undergrads, and then the green one are lab managers. So thanks to all of them, this project is unique because lots of students got involved and got the idea of what, how to work with the project as sensitive as this one and get involved in this project. So thank you very much.
All right, so to round out our presentation for this morning, before we open it up to everyone for questions, just wanted to highlight that this project got underway just before a kind of major turn in the discipline in my field of anthropology, specifically biological anthropology, and more specifically skeletal biology. I'm sure many of you are aware of the what occurred several years back with the University of Pennsylvania. The remains of those individuals, for those who are not, there were individuals found there who were family members of the Africa family. They were part of an organization known as MOVE. It was in Philadelphia, where a building was bombed in the 80s. And the remains were found there. And they ended up being used for teaching purposes and even being used for online tutorials, completely unbeknownst to the family members. And so this created a stir, in our field, to the extent that the American Anthropological Association is currently is sponsoring a commission that is going around the world looking at the ethical treatment, how to ethically, whether or not skeletal research continues and how to do so ethically. Similarly, the American Association of Biological Anthropologists has a task force similarly tasked with looking into this question of how we engage with communities. So I'm sure many of you are aware of NAGPRA, the law by which at least federally recognized tribes, indigenous Native American tribes, are to have their funerary artifacts and human ancestral skeletal remains returned. In this case, there are no such protections for African American remains, which are often found in a vast variety of contexts. Under buildings, having been removed during the construction of roads, and so forth. And so I think it's to the credit of the VCU that this process was really initiated, before, this furor over the mistreatment and mishandling of skeletal remains. And it serves as we offer it up as one model of how to move forward ethically and to establish mutuality. Roger Sanjak writes about mutuality and in community engagement. And he says that it may be possible to combine what he calls the academic kind of career complex and the goals of the researcher at the academic institution and those of the community members who may or may not engage or kind of see themselves within that process, but nonetheless are very valuable both as sources of information and expertise, and then also valuable in the sense that what we do impacts them. Whether or not they are directly engaged. And so an ethical engagement requires that we do consult with them early and often, and that they be given a role, a seat at the table, and not just a seat at the table in any kind of performative or symbolic way, but that they actually have decision-making power. And so all of the research that you've seen here has been completely vetted by the FRC. They, at every step of the way, they are informed and can decide how the research should proceed. And so we've had to be nimble in some cases, and it is an iterative process, as it should be. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight that aspect of the project, and we will speak, each of us will be able to speak to that a little more this afternoon as we talk about how our own specific roles within the project have played out. So with that, I think I would like to just acknowledge the ancestors once again. Thank you, and open it up for questions.
All right, can everyone hear me? Yes. Yep. All right, so for folks in the room, if you have questions, please feel free to go to either this mic or this mic. If you are on the Zoom, please type your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to them as well during the session. We have about 20-25 minutes or so. Yeah, just for in the room, if you could come over to line up at either one of these mics if you have questions. And for the people on the panel, if you don't mind just repeating the question after it's asked, just to make sure everyone, both here and online, can hear it.
Hi all, thank you for that amazing presentation. My question was about the ethical considerations and the process for connecting the remains of ancestral individuals that are found to modern day descendants, because you mentioned that that would be the next phase of the project. So could you talk a little bit about the kind of ethical processes and considerations therein? Thank you.
I think you were talking about the points.
I don't know exactly in terms, so this process, of course, when we will dealing with identifiable people, we have to have a process behind it.
Your mic isn't on.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, maybe here? Okay, thank you. So I'm sorry, I forgot to repeat the question was about the ethical considerations of linking these individuals to people in the community. Was that the question? So of course, when we are dealing with identifiable people, it's a little bit different. Of course, we have to have IRB approved, which is the Institutional Review Board approved, which we already have. And of course, the handling of the samples has to be anonymous. Of course, we have to have a way to link them, but everything that is done in the lab is processed in an anonymous way. But yeah, I don't know if that was your question in those terms. I don't know if anyone wants to add something.
Yeah, I think for the lab part, we are following IRB approval that we have, and we are trying to make sure the sample that is getting processed are anonymous. So people don't know. But for this part, usually we collect human sample for like other study where we keep sample anonymous all the time. But here we have to have at least one place where we know how to go back to the individual. So nobody else know, but there will be a place where if we have a profile that match with someone, then we can go and connect to that person. So, and there are other processes. University is also working on several things, so it has not been finalized yet.
Yeah, and if I could provide just a little bit of a even a broader context, I would say that for us the ethical considerations around this question really began as soon as the FRC decided that we were going forward with genetic analysis to include public education around what is actually feasible, with the remains, given their age and the conditions under which they were found in a well, which you all know is, water is, one of the worst conditions for preservation. And so even the education around, we considered the ethical implications, even when thinking about the public education that would be required, so that this isn't presented as though we would, definitively, find these connections, explain to people that this is probabilistic, that, there are folks, I grew up in Richmond, but moved to Richmond as a young child. I would not be a great candidate, for this. And so it's not a magic bullet that's going to necessarily connect, us to them. And so just giving people even a sense, for us, the ethics even involves giving people a sense of what, the likelihood is that we would find this. And then on the other side of the process, after the analysis is done, we are currently, thinking through, working through the implications that, ethically, then what becomes, of the ancestral remains in terms of their final disposition, right? Who has the right to decide that if, in fact, a biological link, is established, through the DNA. But we're looking at this really. I used the term earlier, bioculturally, right? So there's history, there's genealogy. This is one line of evidence for us, the DNA. And so that also, I think, is important to note that, this is, we're scientific, but not necessarily scientistic, in our approach, and that we encourage people to do the genealogy. And then this is hopefully a public good, that this is information that we can share. And so yes, so there are broad ethical implications when we talk about linking, past individuals to living individuals, and we're still, working through much of that, looking at contemporary best practices. Thank you for that question.
And I might add just a bit of broader context in terms of thinking about the ethical context in which the work is being done. We were very lucky at the start of the university's engagement. We were very lucky at the start of the university's engagement with the project to be able to connect with Dr. Michael Blakey, who had worked in New York with the African Burial Ground, who really helped us in thinking about framing the approach to the work, because as Stephanie had noted, the history of this was very difficult and very challenging in terms of the institutional relationship with the community. Dr. Blakey was invaluable, and the other institution that I'd like to acknowledge would be the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. So back when the bones were originally discovered, there was some tension between the two state agencies relative to not following through with procedures and how things should move forward. As we put the project in place and began to move forward, while we had not followed the letter of the guidelines in 1994 when the remains were discovered, as we moved forward after 2011, we really tried to align with the spirit of the guidelines, and so we engaged with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, which provides oversight to the process administratively. So in terms of moving forward on any of the recommendations, those have to be reviewed and approved by VDHR, but they require the approval of the FRC relative to moving forward on any of the recommendations.
If I could just cut in, and then John, I'll go to your question. If you could move the slide to the next one, that has a gray background. I realize the white text isn't showing up for everyone, so my apologies about that. Hopefully that will be a bit more legible for everyone in the room. John.
Hello, my name is John Gardner, long since retired, but very much involved in ethics and science for some time before I retired, and a little bit after I retired, because there's quite a demand for analysis of subjects in this area. There are many things that could be said about this area of research, but one that have found particularly interesting is that different cultures have different views as to what is ethical about scientific research into the ancestry of their group. And I think particularly of Native American tribes that have strongly prohibited legally as well as culturally against analyses such as you have been engaged in that delve into the morphological and anthropological history of ancestral groups in their area. And to some extent, there is some suspicion, and I don't know how much evidence, that some of that is motivated by questions of tribal titles to lands. And if one scientist were to find that the ancestral groups from 300 or 400 years previously were radically different than the tribal groups now active in the land, that would be disturbing to the current groups because it would appear to them to weaken their claims to exactly how the land can be used, who can worship what and whom on that land. I wonder if there are any, you're aware of any similar concerns about the intersection of the science and the ethics in regard to, say, the African Americans that you have studied and their relation to tribal groups back in Africa. Any cultural, legal, or political conflict areas there, or can you, does your type of work generally avoid that conflict?
Yes, so you're asking about the potential for, conflict, as you say, political, cultural, and so forth, within the communities that we work with, in this case, the African-American communities that we work with around the science, the scientific research. So So no, we don't avoid that. This is a question that often comes up and sometimes comes up as a criticism or critique of this work. The idea that we work with, the community, or that we speak of the community as though it is a monolith. But again, my background is in anthropology, and internal diversity is to be expected, I think, within every human collective, any human grouping. And so we see this, we don't avoid it, we take it into account. In fact, as part of our best practices, part of what we do, particularly around sensitive areas like skeletal research, is to make sure we are listening to that diversity, and to make sure that those voices that don't necessarily align with those of the researchers are accounted for and are taken seriously, and that those folks also are part of the decision-making, the power and the decision-making process. And so yes, we do have, in this case, there were members of the broader public and at least one member of the FRC, that really was not in favor of skeletal research, but we worked through, a consensus, and we all agreed, that ultimately this is what the broader community wanted, and we as representatives of the broader community could not overturn, the community's wishes, but rather try to hone and to focus, those wishes into an implementable set of recommendations. But yes, that we do see that diversity. In fact, the task force that I mentioned with respect to the American Association of Biological Anthropologists, that task force is actually now putting together a survey and is looking nationwide at African American perspectives on skeletal research. And so this is something that's very much is on our radar and part of our discussions. But again, it's, for us, I don't see it so much as a challenge or a critique, or rather it's just, a challenge, something to be undertaken. And it is why our process is so iterative. What it means for us is that, from site to site, we go through this process of community engagement, whereby, we have to, educate and hear from members of the community, and what we hear back may differ from any given site. And we also build into the process the ability for community members to change their minds and to perhaps even, if in some instances, if they choose under different circumstances to reverse course on certain aspects of the project, they can do so. And so, yes, so this is very much a part of the process. And for me, it's fascinating because as an anthropologist, I'm interested in diversity and intellectual diversity within the communities that we work with, as well as part of the process. Thank you for that question.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted that you're recognizing this complexity and dealing with it.
Yes.
We have a question from online. I'd appreciate it if the speakers could say more about the modalities of the participation of communities, including any participation beyond the Family Council, but also how the Family Council is set up and how it is governed.
Thank you very much for that question. Near the end of the community consultations in early 2015, people were solicited, an offer was made to folks who attended the community conversations to either recommend someone, apply yourself, or volunteer, just go ahead and volunteer for the project. We all put in applications, and some of us were recommended and still had to put in an application. That application was vetted, and we were selected to be community representatives for the family, for the descendant community. We periodically have more community conversations to update the community and to bring them back into the fold to find out, okay, this is what we've done thus far. What else do you want to do? What do you think we should do, should not do? And we just had one of these meetings back in June of this year. And it was done in conjunction with a historic church in Richmond, St. Paul's Episcopal Church, a white church, who has done their own reconciliation project, and they invited us to meet at their facility. And we had a large community turnout where people were brought up to speed with what had happened. Some people didn't know anything about this before and just learned, but they all had an opportunity to give input into what they think should happen going forward. Ultimately, we will be giving more and more frequent reports to the community and soliciting their opinion further on too. Thank you.
Maybe just in commenting on some of the pieces that Stephanie mentioned, if we think about the vetting of the membership of the Family Representative Council, that was done by the Planning Committee, which was half community, half university. And this was a group that had recently in the community gone through some considerable conflict relative to issues around certain properties and lands that the university owned. And so they were still willing to come together to work together in planning this process. I think the FRC has continually vetted their work. So even if we think about their preliminary recommendations, they presented those to the community and got feedback on the preliminary recommendations. Mm-hmm. Final recommendations were then presented again to the community. And then, as Stephanie noted, there have been multiple updates, mm-hmm. including before taking steps on the DNA research, sharing that it was unfortunately during COVID. So some of this was done via Zoom, and getting word out was at times a challenge. But vetting those questions and the proposed process for moving forward. So I think there's been the desire and attempt to continue to connect with, engage with community as the process has moved forward. Right, and so then the ACLS, the American Council for Learned Societies, with work that Dr. Karen Rader and Dr. Joseph Jones led, had a multi-component engagement. ACLS recognized that the pandemic had an incredibly negative impact on community engagement, and so provided support to really try to reinvigorate and catch up with that work. So the event that Stephanie referenced was one portion of that work where there was the opportunity to update, but we also had the opportunity to work with K-12 educators.
Film camp.
Sean Utzi, who we're indebted to for really helping us learn about this history in general, led a film camp with high school students who basically then documented the process and history of the work on the East Marshall Street Well project. So that film we've got and have been able to share that in terms of information about the project.
Also, too, we have 2 postdoctoral students working with us who are beginning an oral history project. We want to get as much information as we can from the community, from our elders who are still around, and those of us who grew up in the community. When you see the film this afternoon, you will hear from voices in the community regarding the community's perception of MCV at the time. There was some concern about what happens to people, or what happened to people when they were in that area after dark, or maybe not in the dark, so you will hear those things then. And we still have people in Richmond now who remember that quite well. So we're going to do a community history project now, oral history project right now to gather as much information as we can from residents.
Good morning. My name is Kimberly Mealy. I work at the American Political Science Association. And first, I'd just like to thank the panel and the family representatives for the care that you have taken to undertake this project and the research as well. I'm wondering what advice you would have to universities or societies or associations that are thinking about or having to begin work that has to do with reconciliation projects and situations like this where there was gross unethical treatment, especially of communities from underrepresented backgrounds. You can imagine that many institutions may look the other way or not want to take this on. It's too expensive, it's too time consuming. What are your recommendations for those institutions?
I think first, the institution must be honest about its history, about what it's found. It's painful, yes, it's painful for all involved. I can imagine that it's painful for a person who is a more progressive thinker now to learn that their ancestors were not so. As a descendant of possibly enslaved people, it's very painful for me now to have to go back through that, and to relive some of that, to relive segregation and all the various things I have experienced, but it's something that must be done, and I think it has to be done openly, honestly, and in a way that does not create rancor caused by a denial, because denial is going to be the worst thing you can ever do. To say that it didn't happen or I had nothing to do with it, to me, that's just a slap in the face, to say that. And, and I've had people say that to me, well, I didn't have anything to do with slavery. Well, yeah, really neither did I, but we're both products of that. So that's what I think is the primary thing, just the honesty of the university in acknowledging its history. So, and its willingness to move forward to create a better community going forward. And if that means spending some money, that's what you have to do. So.
And to maybe add a little, agree with everything that Stephanie voiced. The engagement, authentically, transparently, very important. I think about reflecting on the time period and the number of institutions that have engaged in processes, whether we think about Brown University, whether we think about Georgetown. Multiple universities have gone through perhaps not the identical processes, but other similar processes. And so how do we, relative to the community, how do we, relative to professional associations, think about what we're learning in terms of engagement? How do we look at what the role of the institution should be, could be, and should not be? So there were certain points in the process that we were advised the university needs to step back and not play this particular role, that you need to get support and help in terms of, for example, some of our community process. We took a back seat to that. We participated, but that, both in terms of the engagement with the community and the tension relative to the role, was not an appropriate role for us. When the FRC was doing its deliberations, we tried to protect that space to make sure that the university was not intruding into those conversations so that they could really engage in the recommendations and that we would respect that. So I think, the image I have is a bit, how do you walk with as opposed to prescribe to?
And if I could just add one other thing to it, I think what's really important from the institutional perspective, I think, is that the institution has to come to terms with the fact that it's not going to be able to do business as usual. When we talk about the methodology, the time frame and everything on which we work. I mentioned earlier this, concept that Roger Sanjak uses, mutuality with the academic career complex, right? That we as researchers, as academics have, on the one hand, the pressures that we have, publish. The service that, we conduct, for the university versus that we do for the community, and all of those pressures. Those things, something's going to have to give at some point. Community members are not on, our time frame, nor should they be. They have other considerations often. And so I think also just in terms of, methodology, understanding that, if we're truly going to do community engagement, then it means that something is going to have to change when you bring in those outside perspectives, right? It's about bringing in not just a matter of kind of, what we can offer in terms of shared resources and support and so forth. But then also, how are we changed by this interaction, by this relationship? So that's just to ensure this is a two-way street. And so there should be a space for that. It's not to argue that we are now, scholarship is no longer important, or that, we're not going to pursue research funds. As Dr. Allison mentioned, the funding that we get from ACLS, we get funding from Wintergreen Foundation, helps support some of these activities. However, there's going to have to be a new space, some kind of new space created with maybe even different criteria, for ranking and assessing, those folks who are engaged in this type of work, because again, it does entail different processes than that. Otherwise, we're just kind of projecting our values onto the community, and so it has to be a two-way street in that regard as well.
And I'm struck and want to comment on and acknowledge the generosity of the community, the generosity of the FRC, and we've attempted in ongoing ways. I'm not sure that we've landed yet, but trying to make sure that we're being thoughtful, intentional, and mindful of the generosity of the community, of the FRC, and giving of their time and talents relative to this work. Their commitment has been incredibly humbling, and trying to find respectful and appropriate ways to support the work, acknowledge the work.
You reminded me of one other thing, Dr. Allison. Institutional humility. That's the term we use in the recommendations report when we said humbling, and that's I think that maybe above all is that the institution has to understand that this is about power sharing, right? Kind of giving up some of that power. And so in order to do that, we have to be humble, understand that we're dealing with communities that have traditionally been marginalized. And so they may not always be comfortable with kind of voicing their opinions initially. And when they do, kind of back away from the process, often they will vote with their feet rather than kind of, come outright and challenge, institutional representatives. And so yes, so humility, thank you for that. Humility on, kind of on all of our parts is necessary.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. This has been incredible to hear about. I was wondering what recommendations you can have, or if you can describe processes by which you've engaged with the broader community, not descendant communities, who might be politically disinclined to allow this kind of work, or who would want to push back against it politically or otherwise.
I'm reflecting on some of the process over the years in terms of the work, and it is work that has taken considerable time and considerable commitment on multiple groups. And I'm actually thinking about some conversations before the presentation of the FRC's final recommendation. And there were a group of young people who had not been part of the process, the community process that we had in terms of presenting the information that we had learned from the studies that had been done up to, say, 2014, 2015, and had not known the history of the formation of the FRC and the community engagement that took place. And so I think when they came to that meeting relative to the presentation of the final recommendations, they were ready to voice and share some concerns that they had. But I think as they heard the recommendations, also learned about the process, it was learning for all of us that sometimes when you're so embedded in a process and moving things along, it's so important to try to continue to engage and keep the broader community up to date. And that's been, we acknowledge that's been a struggle for us, and particularly during the pandemic, it was quite a challenge.